Great stuff. Good morning. I was very excited when Ron phoned me up and said, could you please come and talk about the Enlightenment? And I thought, well, that's good stuff because economics, or modern economics, as a discipline has its origins in the Enlightenment. And I thought, well, that's what I can do. And economics, I have to say, over the last while certainly has gone off the rails. Now, we might think in terms of the Keynesian revolution has been a dreadful mistake, which is, of course, entirely correct. But also microeconomics has gone off the rails since the publication of Arthur Cecil Bigu's The Economics of Welfare. And I wrote recently about that in an IPA publication called The Economist, a Social Engineer. And in retrospect, perhaps I should have delivered that paper here instead of the one that I intend to deliver. But if you do want to see the other paper, it is on the IPA website. If you want copies of my slides, they're at my blog site, catalaxyfiles.com, so please go along and have a look at that and drag out the slides if you would like to have a copy, or I'm sure Jess could happily provide you with some. Now, if we just start off with some Enlightenment thinking, Adam Smith very famously said that little else is required to carry a state from the highest degree of opulence, from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. And any government that tried to arrest that sort of activity would have to be oppressive and tyrannical. Now, we can quibble over what is the meaning of easy taxes. I think Australia has a very oppressive tax regime, and tolerable administration of justice, I think, is probably somewhat intolerable. But nonetheless, we can quibble over these things, but all the rest that he said to us comes about from the natural course of being. So our great prosperity as a society and as a civilization comes from what Adam Smith calls all the rest. And that really is the division of labor, specialization, and trade. Those are the things Adam Smith talks about. Now, in our market economy, we have got an exchange economy. And the discipline of economics should really be about understanding exchange, not so much efficiency and those other good things that people talk about. Now, when we think about exchange, we realize that, in actual fact, competition isn't as important as is cooperation. We cooperate in order to compete, and where we cooperate is in establishing the rules under which we trade. Now, those rules very often are the mechanisms which structure, organize, and legitimize trade. So what we are really doing when we are trading is that we are swapping our property rights one for the other. And in order to swap property rights one for the other, we have to actually have an agreement as to what our property rights are. And once we have that sort of agreement, we then start thinking about, well, where do they come from, how do we define them, and so on. So the great American economist Harold Demsetz tells us that property rights are an instrument of society. Now, that immediately takes us away from ideas of the Robinson Crusoe economy and sort of hermit individualism and all the sort of stuff which people sometimes talk about. We need to realize we live in a society. And one of the things that the left often beat us with is they say, I want to live in a society, not an economy. Well, we can all agree. We should all appropriate that line and say, yes, we all live in a society and not an economy. We shouldn't allow them to get away with that. So there are the expectations of society, and they allow us to develop our expectations that we can reasonably hold in our dealings and tradings with others. But then the question becomes well, where do our property rights come from? Well, there's an efficiency hypothesis which basically says that rights evolve out of internalizing opportunities for trade and exchange and realization of value. I think we'd all like that definition in this room. The second definition comes from what might be called legal centralism, and that says to us property rights only exist if they are granted by government. Now, there are some property rights that do only exist because they are granted by government, the TRIPS, intellectual property, ghastly patents and things like that. But nonetheless, most property rights don't come from there, but that is where the nub of limitations of our freedom come from. Now, I just want to pick on very quickly coercion, because coercion does play a very important part of the state, and we shouldn't be totally opposed to all forms of coercion, because coercion is about enforcement of contract. But Hayek tells us that coercion occurs when one man's actions are made to serve another man's will, not for his own, but for the other's purpose. That is from the Constitution of Liberty, and I was very pleased to see Barbara saying that this is the 50th anniversary of the Constitution of Liberty. It is remarkable that there have been no books, no celebrations, no special conferences, all these things to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Constitution of Liberty. Last year was the 60th anniversary of von Mises's Human Action, and again, no books, none of this. Quite surprising. But nonetheless, so we need to think about coercion, and we have here what is known as the Rand curve. Now, the Rand curve has very simply size of government here on the x-axis, GDP growth on the y-axis, and we can see as the size of government increases, so GDP growth rapidly expands, but that is a turning point that we need to be cognizant of. Our friends in the People's Republic of China are somewhere down here. They are moving up that curve from that direction, and I'm afraid that most Western societies are moving down the curve in that direction too. So that is something we need to be cognizant of, but there are levels of coercion which are efficient, which add to our ability to trade and exchange property rights. But this is where von Mises basically puts the nub of the social dilemma, or the liberal dilemma if you want to think of it, and he says the main problem we face is how to prevent the police power of the state from becoming tyrannical. That is what the struggle for liberty is all about, and he goes on to tell us, politically there is nothing more advantageous for a government than an attack on property rights, for it is always an easy matter to incite the masses against the owners of land and capital. That is the challenge which all business faces, and how that struggle manifests itself in what I call policy entrepreneurs. Now, normal entrepreneurs are people which identify a gap in the market and try to make money. Policy entrepreneurs also try to identify gaps in the market, but not for the purposes of making money, but for the purposes normally of expanding the state. Policy entrepreneurs can imagine a better future, a better society, a better allocation of property rights. That's fine. They normally engage in what is known as the Nirvana Approach, and the Nirvana Approach is based on one of three fallacies. The grass is always greener, there can be a free lunch, and people can be different. These are the fallacies which social engineers constantly make over and over again. So if we just think of this in terms of a matrix, let's imagine we have a policy entrepreneur who comes along and says the status quo is deficient, and they make a policy proposal. Now we can have the status quo is deficient, and they make a policy proposal. At that point we simply debate the detail. That's more or less straightforward. Or we can have the status quo is not deficient, there's no policy change, and we do nothing. Those two states of nature are fairly straightforward. But where we inevitably find ourselves is here. Some people start claiming the status quo is deficient and we need to have a policy proposal. So let's imagine the status quo is deficient in that Australian miners don't pay enough tax, and therefore we're going to tax the bastards. Okay? What happens then? We immediately start having a huge debate. There's a great deal of societal conflict, because there's actually two debates going on. Do Australian miners actually not pay enough tax? That is itself is one debate. And the other debate is the idea of taxing some fictitious notion of rent a good idea or a bad idea? So we can't actually get into debating the details because we are having a values debate at this point here.